I am 95 years old. At this age, you do not tell stories because they are interesting. You tell them because there is finally no reason left to hide them. The body slows first. The hands shake when you lift a cup. The stairs begin to feel taller than they used to be. But the mind has a habit of wandering backward. Mine wanders to a small yellow house that stood 2 doors down from where I lived for nearly 20 years. A house that, for most of my life, meant nothing more than a neighbor's place. Until it didn't. I learned something 17 years ago. I was 78 then, old enough to believe I already understood my life. But I didn't, not even close. The truth arrived in the quietest way possible. No shouting, no dramatic moment, just a sentence spoken carefully across a kitchen table. And it changed the meaning of 40 years. But to understand that, I have to go back. I was 27 when I married Helen. She had dark hair that curled at the ends when it rained. Not the kind of curls women pay for today. The kind that appeared on their own. She laughed easily. That was the first thing people noticed. We met at a church picnic in 1958. I remember the smell of charcoal and the way the grass stuck to the bottoms of our shoes. She asked if I could pass the lemonade. I spilled some while handing it to her. She said, "Well, that's one way to make an impression." That was Helen. Gentle teasing, nothing sharp. We married 8 months later. In those days, people didn't wait very long. You felt something steady, something decent, and that was enough. I worked at a small hardware supply company, nothing glamorous, mostly invoices, deliveries, inventory lists. Helen worked part-time at a dentist's office. We rented a small house on Maple Street when I turned 30. It had a narrow porch and a tree in the front yard that leaned slightly to the left, like it had grown tired of standing straight. That tree is still there, I'm told. The house next door belonged to a man named Walter. Walter moved in a few months after we did. He was about my age, maybe 2 or 3 years older. Tall, quiet, polite in the way men were back then. A quick nod when you passed on the sidewalk. He worked construction, left early in the morning, came home dusty and tired. I didn't know much about him. Truth is, men didn't ask many questions in those days. We talked about weather, lawnmowers, sometimes baseball. Nothing deeper. Helen knew him better than I did. That's what happens when one person spends more time at home. She would water the flowers in the afternoon. Walter sometimes worked on his truck in the driveway. They talked. Nothing strange about that. Neighborhoods used to be like that. People drifted into conversations over fences and hedges. I never thought twice about it. Not then. Our daughter, Emily, was born 3 years after we moved into that house. I remember holding her the first time. She had a strong cry, louder than I expected from something so small. Helen was exhausted but smiling. "She's going to keep us busy," she said. And she did. Children rearrange your life quietly. Suddenly the days fill with things you never planned. Doctor visits, school meetings, scraped knees, birthday cakes. I worked longer hours when Emily was small. The hardware company expanded, and they needed someone dependable in the warehouse office. I said yes to everything. Extra shifts, weekend inventory counts, late shipments. At the time it seemed responsible. A man provides. That's what we believed. Helen handled most things at home. She walked Emily to kindergarten. She packed lunches. She stayed up when Emily had a fever.
I told myself that my job was different. My job was to keep the lights on.
Walter remained our neighbor through all those years. He never married. People mentioned it sometimes. Strange for a man his age, someone once said at a block gathering, but nobody pressed him about it. Emily liked him. Children have a way of attaching themselves to the quiet adults. He would fix small things for her, a loose wheel on her bicycle, a broken latch on her toy box. Once he built her a small wooden birdhouse, painted it blue. She carried it around the yard for 2 days before we nailed it to the tree. "Walter made it," she kept saying. I thanked him, of course. It felt like the polite thing neighbors did. Years passed. Emily grew tall, then taller. She had Helen's eyes, dark and thoughtful. She asked questions about everything. Why the moon followed the car when we drove at night. Why some people lived alone. Why grown men sometimes looked tired even when they weren't working. I answered what I could. What I didn't know, I brushed aside. That's another thing men used to do. We pretended certainty. Helen and I had our share of quiet disagreements. Nothing explosive, just the slow friction that comes from two people living inside routines for too long. I worked late, she said I missed dinners, I said the job required it. Neither of us raised our voices, but silence can stretch just as far as anger. Walter stayed next door through it all. I remember small things now that I didn't notice then. The way he watched Emily's school plays from the back row of the auditorium. I assumed someone had invited the neighborhood. The way he always seemed to know when she had a science project or a piano recital. Helen probably mentioned it in conversation. That's what I told myself. Memory rearranges things when you get old. You start to notice the edges of moments that once felt ordinary. Emily moved away when she was 23. She became a nurse, since she wanted to work where people actually needed help. She called often at first, then less often. That's the rhythm of adult children. They build their own lives. Helen grew quieter in those years. She sat on the porch more. Sometimes she watched the street without saying anything. I thought she was simply aging. We both were. Walter was still next door, still fixing things, still nodding when I passed him. Helen died when I was 76. A stroke in the early morning. Quick, the doctor said. There are strange comforts people offer when death arrives. Quick, peaceful, as if those words soften the empty chair at the table. The house felt too large afterward. Emily came for the funeral. She stayed 3 days. We spoke mostly about practical things, bills, paperwork, the house. After she left, the quiet returned. Walter helped me repair a loose step on the porch a few months later. We worked side by side without much conversation. At one point he stopped hammering and looked toward Helen's old garden. "She loved those roses," he said. I nodded. Neither of us spoke after that. He moved away the following year, just packed a truck and left. Said he had family in another town. I shook his hand in the driveway. "Take care of yourself," I told him. He smiled in that small way he had. "You too." That was the last time I saw him. For many years, life simply narrowed, the way it does in old age. The world becomes a few rooms, a few routines, a few voices on the phone. Then one afternoon, 17 years ago, Emily came to visit unexpectedly. She was 48 by then, older than Helen had been when we first moved into Maple Street. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she once did her homework. She looked tired, not physically tired, something else. "Dad," she said. That word always sounded smaller when spoken by an adult child. "There's something I think you should know." The sentence hung in the air for a long time.
I remember the clock ticking.
I remember thinking she might be sick, or moving far away. Instead, she said something else, something quiet. "Walter was my father." I didn't understand at first, not truly. The words were simple, but the meaning took time to land. I remember saying, "Walter lived next door." She nodded. "Yes." The room felt strangely still, like the air had stopped moving. She explained slowly. Helen had told her before she died, not in anger, not as a confession meant to wound, just a truth she didn't want buried. Walter had been part of Helen's life before I met her. They had remained close, closer than I knew. Emily said they never intended for things to happen the way they did, but life rarely follows intentions. She told me Walter knew. He had known from the beginning. That's why he stayed. That's why he watched from the back rows. That's why he fixed bicycles and built birdhouses. Not because he was simply a kind neighbor, but because he was standing as close to fatherhood as he was allowed. I sat there for a long time. At 78 years old, you think your past is settled, but it isn't, not always. I asked Emily only one question. Did Helen love him? She thought for a moment, then said, "She loved you both differently." That answer stayed with me. Not because it solved anything, but because it felt honest. Walter died 6 months before Emily told me. Cancer, she said. He never reached out, never tried to explain. Maybe he believed silence was the price he owed. Or maybe he believed I had already given him something without knowing it. The chance to watch his daughter grow from the yard next door. What is permanently lost in a life like mine is difficult to describe. It isn't just trust or pride. It's something stranger, an entire version of the past. For 40 years, I believed I understood my own family. But I didn't see the whole picture. I missed the quiet sacrifices, the silent arrangements between two people who cared about the same child. I also missed the loneliness of a man who lived 20 feet away from the daughter he could never call his. When I walk past the old neighborhood now, on the rare days my legs allow it, I sometimes stop in front of that yellow house. Someone else lives there now. They've painted the door green. The tree is still leaning. Time doesn't erase things. It just layers new lives over the old ones. If you're listening to this, I won't pretend there's a lesson waiting neatly at the end. Life doesn't wrap itself that way. I only know that certainty is a fragile thing. We move through our days believing we understand the people beside us. Most of the time we don't. We understand pieces, moments, fragments. The rest stays hidden in quiet corners of someone else's heart. I sometimes wonder if Helen wanted to tell me earlier. Maybe she tried and couldn't find the words. Maybe she believed protecting everyone meant carrying the truth alone. I will never know. That's the nature of time. It closes doors without explaining why. If there is something I wish I had known sooner, it's this. Lives overlap in ways we rarely notice. Love isn't always tidy, and the people who seem distant from our story may actually be standing inside it. I don't feel anger now. Age has a way of sanding down sharp emotions. What remains is a quiet sadness and a strange respect for the man who lived next door. Walter spent 40 years watching a life he could never fully claim. I spent 40 years raising a daughter who was never fully mine. And yet,
We both loved her. That part, at least, was real. I am 95 now. There aren't many years left. Probably not many months, if I'm honest. The body knows. The nights grow longer. The mornings arrive slower. Emily still visits sometimes. She sits at this same table. We talk about ordinary things. Weather.
Her work, the way the world has changed. Sometimes we sit quietly. She pours tea. I watch the steam rise from the cup. And I think about the birdhouse Walter built all those years ago. It hung on that crooked tree until the wood finally split. For a long time, small birds nested there every spring. Emily loved watching them. I suppose that's the closest thing to peace this story has. 3 people standing around the same life. Not perfectly, not honestly, but with care in their own ways. When my time comes, and it will, sooner rather than later, I hope Emily remembers the ordinary parts, the bike rides, the school mornings, the nights we waited for the moon to follow the car. Because even if the truth arrived late, those moments still belonged to us. And for an old man nearing the end of the road, that has to be enough.